Hello, this is Professor Miller, and I am back with my final slideshow presentation for you all. This is on Betty Boop and Fleischer Studios. This is a part of our final module entitled The Roaring Twenties from the Margins. We've been looking at the margins of the 20s from an African-American perspective so far, but with this one we are taking a look at it from the perspective of the artistic creations of two Jewish American immigrants, Max and Dave Fleischer, creators of Betty Boop, among other things. So let's get started. Max and Dave Fleischer were the creative force behind Fleischer Studios, one of the early major producers of animated short films. Max, the older brother, was the main creative genius of the group, whereas Dave sometimes served as a model for the cartoon characters, which would then get changed after that. They would just use his physique to create the outlines for the character. But he mainly served, Dave did, mainly served as the producer for the studio. Max was really the genius of the group. He's the one credited with most of the outstanding inventions. Born in Krakow, Poland, they were brothers in a Polish, Yiddish-speaking Jewish family. Their family immigrated to the United States in 1887, settling in New York City. And Max and Dave grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, which was then and still is now a poor working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn. Only then it was mostly poor Jewish immigrants, whereas today, of course, it's mostly poor African-American, not immigrants, but poor African-Americans. They spoke Yiddish growing up in their family, and the culture of Yiddish permeates the Betty Boop cartoons as well as other cartoons. In fact, if you watch enough of them, you'll hear Yiddish spoken. Sorry, I'm a little off today. You'll hear Yiddish spoken, and that was pretty odd for that day. Most mainstream non-Jewish Americans were not used to hearing Yiddish words. Even simple Yiddishisms like schlep hadn't entered the mainstream vocabulary. So they were showing and portraying through sound a little bit of what it felt like to be a Jewish American immigrant through the lens of their cartoons. More on the importance of Fleischer Studios. Max Fleischer invented the rotoscope, which was a pioneering device which made animation much easier to create. It allowed them to effectively trace live-action animation so that they didn't have to draw one after another in kind of guesswork. They were able to trace the pattern of movement of models. And we see this technique, this pioneering technique of the rotoscope, used in one of the Betty Boop cartoons I've assigned for you to watch, one called Betty Boop's Bamboo Isle. You are assigned to watch that one, and you'll see at the beginning some live-action, actual human beings hula dancing. And then later, if you watch all the way through, which you should, you'll see Betty Boop doing a kind of sexy dance while she's being spied on. And while she's doing this dance, which progressively for its time she was topless, although her naughty bits, so to speak, were protected, were covered by her leg and her hair. Nothing's really exposed, but nevertheless, just the fact that she was conceptually topless was pretty transgressive for its era. But back to that rotoscope thing. So at the beginning, like I said, you see these live-action hula girls dancing, and they used that live-action footage with the rotoscope to create Betty Boop's dance later. You can see an exact parallel in the movements of Betty Boop's hips and legs with those of the hula dancers earlier. This is one of many advances in animation pioneered by Max Fleischer. He preceded Walt Disney and for a time outshone Disney as America's premier creator of animated short films. More on the importance of Fleischer Studios. Although they had some early success with their first characters, Coco the Clown and Fitz the Dog, Betty Boop was their breakout cartoon character. Fitz actually interacts with Betty in some of the early Betty Boop cartoons before it evolves to more of a Betty Boop show. The first Betty Boop cartoons, in fact, showed Betty Boop as a half-poodle, half-human, which are very strange to look at if you are familiar with the, most popular incarnation of Betty Boop. If you've ever seen Betty Boop, or like some of us, if you grew up with Betty Boop cartoons, seeing this weird anthropomorphic half-poodle, half-human version of Betty Boop is quite odd. But that's how she started out in 1930 in a cartoon called Dizzy Dishes. Max Fleischer finalized Betty Boop in her completely human form in 1932 in a cartoon called Any Rags. And Boop was hugely popular and often appeared before feature films in her day. So ordinary American families would go to the movies to watch a film, and there would be Betty Boop in the prelude to the film. Maybe some of you could even remember or have seen films that are preceded by cartoons, although nowadays they're mostly preceded by advertisements, which is a sad and sorry loss. But when I was growing up watching cartoons, we would be watching Bugs Bunny or whatever it might be before the cartoons, and then before the movie, and then the movie would start. And that was a long-standing tradition, now pretty much vanquished, although you might see some still in certain art theaters. But back in the days of Fleischer Studios, it was common practice to show cartoons before the major films. And Betty Boop, for a while, was the most popular pre-film cartoon feature in the United States. She was hugely popular and really broke boundaries for cartoons in terms of their integration with mainstream America. Aspects of Boop cartoons would not be acceptable in today's mainstream environment. For example, officially, Betty Boop was only 16 years old, according to a 1932 interview with Max Fleischer, though she later played an older married woman. So yeah, the kind of like sexy, flirty version of Betty Boop as a teenager, as a 16-year-old teenager, obviously wouldn't wash today. But laws were different then, and marrying ages were different then, and she was pushing the boundaries then, but she wasn't in the terrain of what we would consider illegal, actually, if it was portrayed today. Although the Fleischers loved jazz music and seemed to have befriended certain African-American musicians who they employed, they were considered progressive for their era and all that. Nevertheless, some of their cartoons seem quite racist by today's standards. In fact, in the one I assigned, Betty Boop's Bamboo Isle, one of the three I assigned as must-watch cartoons, there is an actual blackface performance as Betty Boop is being spied on. And obviously, that's not something that would work very well today. And, of course, Boop is quite sexist in her, idiotic portrayal. She's not the sharpest tool in the tool shed, as the saying goes. I'm wondering how well Boop would do today. Probably not so well for various reasons. But back then, nobody had such qualms about her, and no one really batted an eye about these aspects of her, except her flirty sexiness, not because she was too young, but because she was too sexy, which became an issue later in the history of Boop. More on Betty Boop. She is known as the first and one of the most famous sex symbols of the animated screen. She made a reprise in the not too dated film, maybe some of you have seen it, Who Framed Roger Rabbit? Boop plays a role in that sort of meta cartoon film. It's actually pretty interesting if you haven't seen it. It's important to note, pay attention to this. This is very important. You're going to be writing about Boop for a short assignment. This is something you really need to know. Boop is not a character of the 20s so much as a character from the 30s looking back on the 20s. So she may find her earliest prototypical beginnings at the very end of the 20s, but it's not until the 30s that she achieved the form that we know her for today. And she was mainly popular in 33 and 34. So what we have here is a Depression-era symbol of the more carefree days of the Jazz Age flappers. These are Depression-era Americans looking back with nostalgia and a certain amount of criticism at the Roaring Twenties via Betty Boop and her flapper escapades. Thus, coming at the end of the 20s, after the 20s are over, and looking back on the decade, I believe these cartoons make a fitting conclusion to our class, exploring the 20s, which, as you may recall, began with other cartoons, non-animated ones, of course, but began with newspaper and magazine cartoons depicting the Red Scare. So we began with cartoons, we end with animation. And that's, kind of part of the symmetry of the class that I've tried to sort of bake into it. Betty Boop was way ahead of her time in Boop Oopa Doop, also assigned viewing. The titles of these are really fun to say. In Boop Oopa Doop, Betty is a high-wire performer in a circus. The villainous ringmaster lusts for Betty as he watches her from below. Then later Betty returns to her tent. The ringmaster follows her. He offers her a massage. He starts to sensuously massage her legs, and he surrounds her in this sort of threatening manner. And eventually he actually threatens her, suggesting she'll lose her job if she doesn't submit to his advances. This is one of the earliest portrayals of sexual harassment in the workplace, one of, if not the earliest, and it was very daring at the time when it was first produced. Betty Boop also has a political side. The Fleischers were left-leaning Jewish Americans, and there is a class-conscious leftist side to Boop, who often is portrayed as a sympathetic working girl struggling for her rights. Nevertheless, there's some complexity to it, because in one of the best episodes, which I believe I've also assigned, Betty Boop's Big Boss from 1933, the Fleischer brothers wrong-foot the audience. After the usual menacing advances from the Big Boss man, there is a vast mobilization of outraged citizens, including the Army and the Navy, out to rescue Boop from the horrible clutches of her capitalist manipulator. But when the rescuers break in to discover Betty and the Big Boss man, they are happily embracing as if they like each other and would just as soon be left alone. The cartoon closes with astonished exclamations of disgust from those who have come to rescue her. These sort of adventurous, politically daring, and edgy Boop cartoons changed for the worse in 1934, when increasingly powerful censorship laws began to temper Boop and restrain her. The early Betty Boop was a sort of jazz baby type character, one whose innocent sexuality appealed to adult audiences. The critics began to worry, not so much the critics, but the censors began to worry that children would see this, it wouldn't be appropriate. And the National League of Decency, an early film censorship organization, and their production code of 1934 created guidelines which imposed specific rules on the motion picture industry, restricting even animated portrayals of women's sexuality. This greatly affected the content of the films of Mae West and others, as well as the Boop cartoons, which seemed tamer and far less imaginative and daring than they did in their previous versions. Fleischer Studios went on to great later success. After Boop, they invented Popeye the Sailor, their most financially profitable character, who for a while was even more popular than Mickey Mouse, Disney's most popular character. Although the Fleischer brothers didn't invent Superman, he was a comic book hero first in print comics, but they were the first to take the print comic and translate Superman into an animated cartoon. So they're the first animated Superman. Their studios were pretty successful. They made money. They were comfortable, but they were nowhere near as successful as Walt Disney, who was probably a better businessman, although not a more creative animator, I would argue, than Max Fleischer. Max Fleischer and Fleischer Studios will be remembered as pioneering inventors in animation, and they are already heroes to the animation community. They're known to cartoonists and others as great artists. So whatever you may think about these sometimes silly cartoons, I would invite you to approach them with more of an adult eye and analyze these cartoons in a sophisticated way, trying to look at the subtext and the subtle meanings that you see there, and to pick one and to write about it for your short one-page assignment, which is due. So I hope this gives you a little more perspective on the Fleischer Studios and Betty Boop. And I will say goodbye to you now. This may be the last time you hear my voice for this class, so I hope you've enjoyed the class. Hope you got a lot out of it. We can still meet if you need to. Drop me an email, and we'll try to work that out. But if this is the last time you hear my voice, I wish you the best in your final paper and in your Boop paper. So that's it, and I hope you've had a great summer and a great class.